1. The Forbidden Dance. Before Elvis made adults uncomfortable, Hank Ballard was getting records banned outright. Work With Me, Annie, released in early 1954, spent 7 weeks at #1 on the R&B charts. The lyrics weren't subtle. Work didn't mean employment. Radio stations refused to play it. The FCC received complaints. Parent groups organized boycotts. So Ballard wrote a sequel, Sexy Ways. Then another, Annie Had a Baby. That one revealed Annie couldn't work anymore because she'd gotten pregnant. The controversy doubled sales. What's forgotten is that Ballard also wrote The Twist in 1958. His version flopped. 2 years later, Chubby Checker covered it and sparked the biggest dance craze of the 1960s. Ballard watched someone else get rich off his song, twice in one career. 2. The Parking Lot Song. The Penguins recorded Earth Angel in a garage in Los Angeles in 1954. They pressed it themselves and sold copies out of car trunks. The song was built on a chord progression borrowed from dozens of earlier songs, the same IVVV pattern that would later drive Stand By Me, Every Breath You Take, and roughly 1/3 of all pop music ever written. The Penguins didn't invent it, but they made it immortal. Earth Angel became the first doo-wop song to cross over to white audiences, reaching #1 on the R&B charts and #3 on the pop charts. It was also the first song to be played at thousands of high school proms. The first song countless couples called Our Song. Then came the lawsuit. The song's actual composer, Jesse Belvin, had sold his rights for a few dollars. Different parties claimed ownership for decades. When the song appeared in Back to the Future in 1985, the royalty checks went to people who'd never stood in that garage. The Penguins never had another hit. Lead singer Cleveland Duncan spent his later years working as a security guard. 3. The crossover hit. Shboom by The Chords might be the most covered song of 1954, and that was the problem. The Chords' original, released in March, was raw R&B with nonsense syllables that confused white radio programmers. Within weeks, a Canadian group called the Crew Cuts recorded a sanitized version. Their cover went to #1. The Chords peaked at #5. This pattern repeated constantly throughout the 1950s. Black artists created, white artists copied, white artists charted higher. Pat Boone built an entire career on this model, covering Little Richard and Fats Domino while smoothing out everything that made the originals dangerous. The Chords' version of Shboom is now recognized as a landmark, one of the first R&B records to chart on pop radio at all. But in 1954, the lesson was clear. The music industry wanted black sound without black faces. 4. The Suicide Note. Johnny Ace was the biggest R&B star of the early 1950s. 8 consecutive top 10 hits, sold-out tours across the country. 25 years old with everything ahead of him. On Christmas Day, 1954, backstage at the City Auditorium in Houston, Ace was playing with a .22 caliber pistol between sets. Big Mama Thornton, who was on the bill, told him to put it away. He pointed it at his girlfriend. She told him to stop. He pointed it at his own head and pulled the trigger. The gun was loaded. Pledging My Love was released a month later. It became his biggest hit, #1 for 10 weeks. The public assumed the romantic ballad was a suicide note. It wasn't. He'd recorded it months earlier, but the myth was better than the truth. Conspiracy theories spread immediately. Some claimed he'd been murdered over gambling debts. Others said it was a game of Russian roulette. The coroner ruled it accidental death. He was playing with the gun, didn't realize a bullet was chambered, and shot himself by mistake. He remains the first rock and roll star to die young. 5. The Censored Lyrics. Little Richard wrote Tutti Frutti about gay sex, specifically about an experience in the back of a venue where he was performing. The original lyrics were unprintable in 1955. They're unprintable now. When Specialty Records wanted to record the song, they hired a songwriter named Dorothy Labostri to clean it up in 15 minutes between takes. She replaced the explicit content with nonsense about ice cream. A wop, bop, a loo, mop, a lop, bam, boom survived because it was Richard's vocal interpretation of a drum pattern. He'd been using it as his stage introduction for years. It meant nothing and everything. The cleaned-up version still terrified white America. Richard's screaming delivery, his makeup, his pompadour, his flamboyance, everything about him was transgressive. He was openly performing queerness in 1955 and somehow getting away with it because the squares couldn't quite tell what they were looking at. Tutti Frutti reached #2 on the R&B charts. Pat Boone's cover, Drained of All Danger, charted higher. 6. The Stolen Credit. Chuck Berry wrote Maybelline based on an old country song called Ida Red. He transformed it completely, New melody, new lyrics, new rhythm. The result was essentially the template for all rock and roll guitar to come. When Chess Records released the song in 1955, two names appeared alongside Barry's as co-writers: Russ Fratto and Alan Freed. Russ Fratto was Chess Records' landlord. He had no musical involvement whatsoever. Alan Freed was the DJ who popularized the term rock and roll and had promoted Barry's music on his radio show. He'd demanded a songwriting credit in exchange for airplay. This was standard practice. DJs took credits on songs they'd never heard before the recording was finished. It was legal bribery, and it made Freed a wealthy man until the payola scandal destroyed him. Barry eventually sued and won back full ownership in 1986. But for 30 years, he'd split royalties with a landlord and a DJ for a song he wrote alone in his St. Louis living room. 7. The Clock Riots. Bill Haley recorded Rock Around the Clock in 1954. It flopped. A year later, it appeared in the opening credits of Blackboard Jungle, a film about juvenile delinquency. Within weeks, it was the #1 song in America. The film's subject matter, teenage rebellion, violence in schools, became inseparable from the music. When Blackboard Jungle premiered in Britain, teenagers rioted in theaters. They slashed seats, danced in the aisles, and fought with police. The song that soundtracked these riots became their anthem. Rock Around the Clock wasn't particularly rebellious. Bill Haley was a pudgy, married, 30-year-old former country singer with a kiss curl plastered to his forehead. But context is everything. The song arrived at the exact moment teenagers were looking for something to call their own. It became the first rock and roll song to hit #1 on the pop charts, selling over 25 million copies worldwide. Haley never matched it. By 1960, he was playing nostalgia shows while Elvis ruled the world. 8. The Fat Man. Fats Domino had been making hits since 1950, when The Fat Man, arguably the first rock and roll record, depending on who you ask, went to #2 on the R&B charts. But he didn't cross over to white audiences until Ain't That a Shame in 1955. Pat Boone's cover charted higher. Of course it did. By 1956, Domino had figured out the formula. Blueberry Hill was a Tin Pan Alley standard from 1940. Domino transformed it with his rolling New Orleans piano and warm, friendly vocal. White parents could accept it because the song was familiar. Their kids could love it because Domino's version had genuine soul. It sold over 5 million copies. Domino would eventually sell more records than any 1950s artist except Elvis. What made him palatable? He was non-threatening. He smiled constantly. He didn't thrust his hips or wear makeup or scream. He just played piano and sang beautifully. White America could accept rock and roll from Fats Domino because he didn't seem like he was trying to steal their daughters. He played the game and won. 9. The White Covers. The Moonglows' Sincerely was climbing the R&B charts in late 1954 when the McGuire sisters heard it on the radio. Within weeks, the McGuire sisters had recorded their own version, note for note, inflection for inflection, an almost perfect replica. Their cover went to #1 on the pop charts. The Moonglows peaked at #20. The McGuire sisters were open about their method. They would listen to R&B records, learn them precisely, then re-record them for white audiences who weren't comfortable buying records by black artists. They weren't the only ones doing it. They were just the most successful. The Moonglows' Harvey Fuqua later married Berry Gordy's sister and helped build Motown. The McGuire sisters retired wealthy. The question of who benefited from whose labor remains unanswerable. 10. The First Rockabilly. The argument over what constitutes the first rockabilly song usually ends with Carl Perkins's Blue Suede Shoes. Perkins wrote it in 1955 after watching a dancer at a honky-tonk warn his date not to step on his new shoes. He stayed up all night writing the lyrics on a potato sack because he had no paper. The song was a perfect fusion: country storytelling, blues feeling, R&B rhythm. It hit #1 on country, R&B, and pop charts simultaneously. The first song ever to do so. Then Perkins crashed his car on the way to perform on The Ed Sullivan Show. While he recovered in the hospital, Elvis covered Blue Suede Shoes. Elvis appeared on Sullivan. Elvis's version became the definitive one. Perkins would later say the accident cost him his career. He was right. He spent the next decade as a sideman for Johnny Cash while Elvis conquered the world with the song he wrote on a potato sack. 11. The 13-year-old star. Frankie Lyman was 13 years old when Why Do Fools Fall in Love hit #1 in 1956. He was the first black teenage pop star, the original child sensation. the template for Michael Jackson and everyone who followed. The teenagers were all teenagers. The youngest was 12, the oldest 17. Their producer at G Records shaped their sound, but Lyman was the undeniable star. His soprano voice hadn't broken yet. He danced like no one was watching. He made grown women scream. By the time his voice changed, his career was over. He was hooked on heroin by 17, drafted into the army, discharged, and dead of an overdose at 25. The song itself was worth millions in royalties. 3 different women claimed to be his widow. The case dragged through courts for decades. The songwriter credit remains disputed. Lyman, of course, died broke. 12. The one-take wonder Gene Vincent recorded Be-Bop-A-Lula in 1956 because Capitol Records wanted their own Elvis. Vincent was a sailor who'd injured his leg in a motorcycle accident. The Navy gave him a medical discharge and a permanent limp. He showed up to the Capitol audition drunk, with a song he'd written with his friend Donald Graves about a stripper they both knew. The session was a disaster until Vincent's manager convinced the label to just let the band play. One take. Be-Bop-A-Lula was cut live, mistakes and all. It went to number 7. Capitol marketed Vincent as the dangerous alternative to Elvis. Leather jacket, sneer, genuine criminal energy. He was too raw for American television but became a god in Britain. The Beatles idolized him. John Lennon named him as his greatest influence. Vincent died in 1971, broke and alcoholic. He was 36. His leg had never healed properly, and he'd spent 20 years in constant pain, self-medicating the only way he knew. 13. Elvis's stolen song, Big Mama Thornton recorded Hound Dog in 1953. It was written by Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, 2 Jewish teenagers from Los Angeles who'd never met Thornton before the session. Thornton's version is raw, dirty, and unambiguous. The Hound Dog is a no-good man, and she's throwing him out. It topped the R&B charts for 7 weeks. 3 years later, Elvis heard a Las Vegas lounge act perform a comedic version and decided to cover it himself. He changed the lyrics slightly and the arrangement completely. His version is about an actual dog, or at least it's vague enough that parents could tell themselves that. Elvis's Hound Dog sold over 10 million copies. It remains one of the best-selling singles of all time. Big Mama Thornton received a one-time payment of $500 for her recording. She never saw royalties. Lieber and Stoller made millions. When Thornton died in 1984, she was living in a boarding house, nearly destitute. 14. The Piano Attack. Jerry Lee Lewis walked into Sun Records in 1956 and announced he was going to be the biggest star in the world. He wasn't wrong. For about 18 months, Whole Lotta Shakin' Going On was considered too obscene for radio. Lewis performed it on Steve Allen's show anyway, pounding the piano so hard the crew worried he'd break it, kicking the bench away, playing standing up. Nothing like it had ever been broadcast on national television. The record sold 6 million copies. Lewis followed it with Great Balls of Fire and became, briefly, bigger than Elvis. Then he married his 13-year-old cousin. 15. The Killer's cousin. Jerry Lee Lewis's career ended in England in May 1958. He arrived for a tour with his new wife, Myra Gale Brown. A reporter asked her age. She said 15. The actual answer was 13. She'd been 12 when they married, and she was also his first cousin once removed. The British press erupted. Shows were canceled. Lewis was sent home in disgrace. Great Balls of Fire was still on the charts. It didn't matter. Radio stations stopped playing his music. His booking fee dropped from $10,000 per night to $250. He wouldn't have another top 10 hit for a decade. Lewis never apologized. He never understood why people were upset. He'd grown up in rural Louisiana where such marriages weren't uncommon. What played in Faraday didn't play in London. He spent the next 40 years in the wilderness, making country albums, battling addiction, and watching 2 more wives die under suspicious circumstances. He outlived Elvis, Johnny Cash, and nearly everyone else who came out of Sun Records. The Killer lived to 97, mean as ever. 16. The Hiccuping Voice. Buddy Holly recorded That'll Be the Day twice. The first version, cut in Nashville in 1956 under the supervision of Owen Bradley, was slick and professional. Decca Records hated it. They dropped Holly from the label and told him he'd never make it in the music business. Holly went back to Texas and re-recorded the song his way. Raw, urgent, with hiccups in his voice that came from nervous excitement. Norman Petty produced it in his Clovis, New Mexico studio, and Brunswick Records released it in 1957. It went to number 1. The hiccups became his signature. Nobody had heard anything like it, a voice that cracked and stuttered with emotion. John Lennon later said it was the first time he realized you didn't have to be smooth to be a singer. Holly formed the Crickets, wrote songs at an astonishing pace, and revolutionized rock and roll for exactly 18 months. Then he got on an airplane. 17. The silent guitar Link Wray's Rumble is the only instrumental ever banned from radio. Ray was a Shawnee guitarist who'd lost a lung to tuberculosis. He compensated by playing harder, louder, meaner than anyone else. In 1958, he needed a B-side for a single and improvised a slow, menacing instrumental at a record hop. The song had no lyrics, no words at all, just a distorted guitar tone that sounded like violence itself. Radio stations refused to play it, claiming it glorified juvenile delinquency. The title alone, Rumble, slang for a gang fight, was enough to get it pulled from playlists. It still reached number 16 on the charts. Every guitarist who ever used distortion as a weapon owes Link Wray. Pete Townshend, Jimmy Page, Neil Young, they all cite Rumble as foundational. The song that taught rock and roll to be dangerous had no words at all. 18. The Uncoverable Song. The Five Satins recorded In the Still of the Night in a church basement in New Haven, Connecticut in 1956. The equipment was primitive. The acoustics were accidental. The result was perfect. Unlike most doo-wop hits, no white group successfully covered it. The song was too delicate, too specific to its moment of creation. The way Fred Parris's voice floats over the harmonies, the way the bass singer anchors the whole thing, it couldn't be replicated by professionals in a studio. The song became the quintessential slow dance record, played at every prom and sock hop for the next decade. It appeared in Dirty Dancing 30 years later and found a new generation. The Five Satins never had another hit. Parris spent years fighting for royalties he'd signed away as a teenager. The church basement where they recorded has no plaque, no memorial. Magic happened there, and then everyone moved on. 19. The gospel rebel Sam Cooke was the greatest gospel singer of his generation. When he decided to record secular music in 1957, his fans considered it betrayal. You Send Me was so smooth it didn't sound like rock and roll. It sounded like something new, a bridge between R&B and pop that nobody had built before. The vocal runs, the effortless phrasing, the sheer beauty of his voice. Sam Cooke invented soul music with a single track. It went to number 1 on both pop and R&B charts, selling over 2 million copies. Gospel audiences never forgave him. Cooke spent the next 7 years becoming one of the most important figures in music history, founding his own record label and publishing company, fighting for civil rights, writing A Change Is Gonna Come. Then he was shot to death in a Los Angeles motel in 1964 under circumstances that remain disputed. The woman he'd brought there said he tried to rape her. The motel manager said he attacked her and she shot him in self-defense. His family never believed it. The case was closed in 10 days. 20. The Hello Goodbye. J.P. Richardson was a Texas DJ who called himself the Big Bopper. He recorded Chantilly Lace as a novelty, a comedy song about talking to his girlfriend on the telephone. Hello, baby. The voice was irresistible. The song hit number 6 in 1958 and made Richardson a star. He quit his radio job and joined the Winter Dance Party Tour alongside Buddy Holly and Ritchie Valens. On February 3rd, 1959, after a show in Clear Lake, Iowa, Holly chartered a small plane to fly to the next venue instead of riding the frozen tour bus. Richardson, who had the flu, convinced Waylon Jennings to give up his seat. The plane crashed shortly after takeoff. Holly, Richardson, and Valens all died instantly. Jennings spent the rest of his life carrying survivor's guilt. Chantilly Lace was Richardson's only hit. The hello that opened it became an epitaph. 21. The day music died, February 3rd, 1959. Buddy Holly was 22. Ritchie Valens was 17. The Big Bopper was 28. The Pilot was 21. Don McLean would call it the day the music died in 1971, and the phrase stuck. But the phrase was wrong. Music didn't die. It just lost 3 of its children, and the 1950s ended 6 weeks early. Ritchie Valens had been famous for 8 months. La Bamba had made him the first Latino rock star, a Mexican-American kid from the San Fernando Valley who'd transformed a traditional folk song into something new. He was terrified of flying. He'd survived a mid-air collision between 2 planes over his junior high school that killed 3 classmates. He flipped a coin with his bandmate for the last seat on the charter. He won the toss, then he lost everything else. Holly's death was the end of something specific. The possibility that rock and roll would be smart, that it would be written by the people who performed it, that it would mature into art. The industry spent the next 4 years marketing clean-cut teen idols while the revolution waited for new leaders. They arrived from Liverpool in 1964. They'd learned everything from Buddy Holly, 22. The teenage anthem Dion DiMucci was on that tour bus when Holly, Valens, and Richardson flew away. He wanted a seat on the plane but couldn't afford the $36. Later, he said his parents' voices were in his head. "That's what we pay for rent." So he stayed on the bus, fell asleep, and woke up to news that changed everything. 5 months later, Dion and the Belmonts released A Teenager in Love. The song was pure teenage melodrama, written by Doc Pomus and Mort Schumann, two Tin Pan Alley professionals who understood that adolescent heartbreak felt like the end of the world. Dion's vocals sold it completely. He sounded like every broken-hearted 17-year-old who ever existed. It was the last great innocent song of the decade. The 1960s would demand something different. 23. The Prison Recording. Johnny Cash didn't actually record Folsom Prison Blues in prison, not at first. He wrote it in 1955 while stationed in Germany with the Air Force, after watching a documentary called Inside the Walls of Folsom Prison. He'd never been to prison. He'd never shot a man in Reno. He was a 23-year-old airman with a guitar and an imagination. The song's most famous line, "I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die," was Cash trying to write the most evil thing he could think of. It worked. The line remains one of the coldest in American music. Sun Records released it in 1956, and it became a modest hit. But Cash spent the next decade convincing himself he was the outlaw the song described. He took amphetamines. He wrecked hotel rooms. He got arrested. He nearly died. In 1968, he finally played Folsom Prison for real, recording the live album that saved his career. By then, he'd earned the song. The 1950s began with Rocket 88 and ended with a plane crash in an Iowa cornfield. In between, rock and roll was born, stolen, sanitized, banned, and reborn. Every artist on this list changed music forever. Half of them died broke. A few of them died young. All of them sang like the world depended on it, because in the 1950s, it did.